So the session today is about the law and politics of fighting corruption. And I want to say one thing up front, that all too often when you analyze corruption, you think that corruption happens only in certain places, that there is a genetic predisposition. So if you have blonde and blue eyes and you live close to the poles, there's no corruption. But if you are dark hair and closer to the tropics, then there is a lot of corruption. I think that that's not true. And I could like me start with an example. When I was a kid in Italy, I started to get interested in politics and corruption because Lockheed had paid all the government throughout Europe. And actually, I double-checked because the only country where somebody went to jail was Italy, because everybody else went away, including the husband of the Queen of the Netherlands that was paid off. And actually, Kissinger knew that he was paid off. But because the Queen threatened to resign, they decided not to intervene. The other thing is that the guy who went to jail in Italy actually got the money for his party, something that in the United States would be considered normal campaign financing. So that is quite important in speaking about the law and politics of corruption. So without further ado, let me start actually from Germany, and Gerhard Schick, I think, is joining us from afar. Gerhard, why don't you start?
Thank you for the kind invitation, and please accept my apologies that I cannot be here in person with you. I'm very sorry about that. And I'd like to start picking up the ball that Luigi just threw to Germany. When I worked as a parliamentarian in a German parliament, I invited a prosecutor from Italy to the Financial Committee. And he told the very surprised German parliamentarians that in almost all the mafia cases he deals with in Italy, money laundering via Germany plays a role. That was new to my colleagues, and it was exactly why I invited him, so that we learn what's going on. I want to take you to that journey of discovery that I made the last years. Germans think of our country mostly as a clean one, where bribery and corruption takes place elsewhere. And what I discovered with the Cum-Ex and Cum-Cum scandals that I'm going to talk about is really something I would have thought unthinkable before I started that investigation. Some words of introduction about Finanzwende, where I now work. We founded that as a counterweight to the financial lobby in Germany, one of Germany's fastest growing non-governmental organizations. Prior to that, I served 13 years as a member of the German Federal Parliament, and one of the more important footsteps I left behind is the investigation on those Cum-Ex deals. I left Parliament in order to found that NGO. I don't want to go too much into the technical details of the deals, because that is not important for our discussion today. Just some important data: more than 10 billion euros stolen from the German taxpayer. Those schemes went on over years and years before decisive government action was taken. And perhaps interesting, just to get an idea of the size, there are now more than 1,800 suspects under investigation by the prosecutors. So it's not one or two criminals around. It's a huge network, and almost all the major banks, both foreign and national, are involved. Only 3 billion euros have been reclaimed, and probably similar trades go on today. There is a bigger brother of Cum-Ex, which is called Cum-Cum. I don't want to delve into the differences. They don't play a role for our discussion today. But it's interesting that, again, the German government took a very long time to react. Those deals go way back to the 1980s. And only in 2016 was relevant government action taken. So far, no one is convicted for criminal action here. The damage is even larger, and the money reclaimed smaller than the case of the Cum-Ex deals. And the question I ask myself is, how could so many people in a democratic country take part in the theft of billions of taxpayers' money for such a long time and almost nobody cares? Because this is something really astonishing, that you find a very small group of persons who actually engaged in investing. Basically, one prosecutor, two journalists, one academic, one politician, myself, and later a successor, but very, very few people. And for a long time, it was considered not interesting, was mainly ignored in the German public. Looking at the tax authorities, we can see that the fact that our tax authorities are decentralized, regional authorities, made it especially easy for banks to get support by regional politicians. In 2017, federal authorities had to intervene and force the regional state of Hamburg to reclaim millions of Cum-Ex profits from a bank, because the regional politicians were so close to the bank and apparently had the view that it was more important to have good relations to local business people and to have the money in their region than to share it with other regions. One of my conclusions is that decentralized tax authorities are more vulnerable to lobbying, especially when regional politicians and banks are involved. Interesting is the role of media. All the journalists who worked on Cum-Ex had legal questions with the Cum-Ex suspects. There was very little media coverage on the parliamentary committee, and very few journalists actually picked up the cases and questioned German politicians. I put here the one anecdote. When Olaf Scholz was elected chancellor, the only journalist who asked about his involvement in the scandal was a Dutch journalist, so a non-German, a foreigner. We see some relation between journalism and the banks involved. And it's important to know here that Germany has both public television and radio and private. So we would say that, or most Germans would say that we have a relatively well-balanced media system, but even so, the influence of the Cum-Ex traders was relevant here. Where I was most surprised was the fact that even our legal system, that most Germans, or I would consider in overall to be very good, developed, very stable, very reliant, showed some weaknesses. There was only one prosecutor, Anne Brohilker, who really engaged in investigating, but she reportedly was blocked from investigating when it came to the role of politicians. And she suffered an attempt by the regional justice minister to take away several cases from her, trying to weaken her investigation. We miss a federal prosecutor's office that would deal with larger, more complex cases and cases where regional politicians are involved or public institutions. And especially, I named that here first, there was a situation where the highest federal court almost declared those schemes legal. Germany would have never been able to recover the billions if that had prevailed. Interesting also the role of academia. We have a well-funded public university system in Germany, and one would say this is very stable against influence by private illegal money. But the suspects try to uphold the myth of a loophole in the tax system and try to influence academic research, hoping that the judges would pick up the paid legal opinions. And professors from public universities just wrote legal opinions, not knowing really what cum-ex was, but just giving their name so that they would support the legality of cum-ex. Cum-ex and cum-cum are a showcase for the role of the lobbyism of the financial lobby. In 2007, the German Federal Parliament passed a law intended to stop cum-ex, but instead it increased the trades because the law was a proposal by Germany's Private Bank Association. So those who did the trades formulated a law that was intended to stopping the trades. It's not surprising that that didn't work. There was a mole in Germany's finance ministry, paid by, I think, banking associations and with links to the industry. And there's also a case of party donations here. We have in Germany a relatively large part of the banking sector covered by public banks. So their role is to be a counterweight to the private profit-oriented banks. And one would hope that these public banks would not participate in schemes that are a theft of taxpayer money. Well, one of the largest players was WestLB, one of the public banks. And not only did the larger public banks participate, they also included the local public banks into the scheme because spreading the scheme would reduce visibility and thereby the risk of discovery. And what is especially shocking is that there is no effort to investigate and declare to citizens what happened from part of the public banks. They're part of the more general effort to cover up everything. The lessons learned. I put two things here and one to go
quickly because your time is
this is the last slide. I would say the most important lesson is that in the financial system we have today, it is possible to raise a lot of money with illegal trades and invest part of that money to influence media, politicians, judges, academia, and thereby continue those trades. And it's very difficult to break this loop between illegal money made and invested in blocking opposition and influencing those structures and institutions that are intended to control. And therefore, I would say not only is it important to strengthen our institutions, but it's also important to change a financial system that allows for so much money be gained in such a short time with opaque and very complicated financial schemes.
Thank you very much, Gerhard. Kevin, why don't you tell us about the United States?
Sure, thanks, Luigi. So yes, my role on this panel is to sort of transition to focusing on the role of law and to start off by providing an overview of what we've touched on a lot over the past half day or so about the fact that the U.S. is stepping back, really, in its enforcement of anti-corruption law, or at least rather the federal government and U.S. federal law is being narrowed and limited in various ways. And so I'll just sort of lay that out, talk about why that might be a problem, and then suggest some of the options for responses to that. And I'm sure John and Vikrant will pick up on that. So first of all, as far as the US is concerned, we've talked about what's happened in terms of foreign corruption, right? So the pause on FCPA enforcement, the decision not to enforce the Corporate Transparency Act, disbanding the Kleptocracy and Asset Recovery Initiative, and the Klepto-Capture Task Force. So that's all probably not good. The defense bar will insist to you that because the FCPA is still in force, people still have to comply, and there's something to that, but, well, it's not being enforced. But it also is interesting to note that the administrative sanctions on corruption are still being applied. It was just 2 weeks ago that Cristina Kirchner from Argentina was denied entry. Well, she was listed as someone who's going to be denied entry to the US. And so there is at least something happening on the foreign front. But I do want to focus actually more on the domestic side, because I don't think we can separate that from this broader discussion. So domestically, things have been happening for a while, actually, in the courts that have narrowed the scope of federal anti-corruption law. There are actually quite a few statutes, different statutes that are used to prosecute corruption at the federal level, the bribery statute, fraud statutes, extortion, gratuities. But I'll just focus on what's happened in the bribery domain, and in particular on 2 cases that have attracted a fair amount of attention. As you know, bribery requires a quid pro quo, right? That's the essence of the offense. Something of value in exchange for basically an official act. That can include maybe an agreement on the part of an official to act as needed, so putting someone on retainer. Most courts say that's sufficient. But what happened in the first case I want to talk about, called McDonnell, is that the court limited the scope of what act qualifies as the quo, part of the quid pro quo. McDonnell was the governor of Virginia, and he basically accepted, it looked like around $175,000 worth of gifts and loans. There's a Rolex, there's the ride in the Ferrari, the $20,000 of gifts for the wife. Classic bribery, you'd think. The problem was what he did in return for that, which was just to arrange some meetings that a manufacturer of supplements wanted with Virginia officials. And the Supreme Court, and I should say unanimously, said that that wasn't sufficient as the quo. That wasn't enough of an official act to meet the definition in the statute. Just arranging meetings wasn't enough. It would have to be something more, right? So that makes it a little harder for prosecutors. If a case that looks on its face as egregious as that can't lead to a conviction, you would imagine that's, that's a setback to some extent. The second case was from just last year. It's the Snyder case, which did not involve the bribery statute. It involved the statute, and it involved a statute that really focuses on state and local and tribal officials, and the branch of the statute that deals with what are called gratuities, right? And in Snyder, what happened was the mayor of a town in Indiana arranged for an associate to get $1.1 million worth of contracts for a garbage truck, and then the next year accepted a check for $13,000, right? So there wasn't an upfront payment. The payment came after the fact, and so it couldn't be, well, according to the majority in the court, it couldn't be characterized as a bribe, but instead, it was charged as a gratuity, where in the gratuity statute says, well, if you reward someone for an official act, even after the fact, that can lead to liability. The problem is the statute that focuses on state and local officials doesn't actually distinguish clearly between bribes and gratuities. It's just all one offense, and it talks about bribery, and then it talks about rewarding, and it's a bit of a mess. So the court said, well, it's not clear enough to us that statute covers the rewards after the fact, so the conviction is thrown out. So at the state level, it's not clear that you can cover cases where the bribe is paid after the fact. Again, a setback for prosecutors. I'll come back to whether that's such a big deal, because there's still a lot that you can do with the classic quid pro quo case, both for federal officials and state officials. More importantly, though, I think recently we've seen shifts in not the decisions of the courts, but also the administration. And I'm from New York, and so I can't help but pay attention to what's been happening with our mayor, Eric Adams, and the decision to dismiss the case against him. The case largely was about campaign finance, but there was a bribery charge in there. And it was all thrown out, even though the evidence seemed, to my eyes, just based on the indictment, reasonably compelling. I think there were questions about the quid pro quo aspect of the case, so it wasn't a slam dunk. But still, it was unusual, shall we say, for the federal government with case that facially appeared to be so strong to decide not to bring the case. And that, I think, is in combination with everything that's been happening on the foreign side and what's been happening in the courts, concerning a lot of observers, suggesting that on balance we've seen some narrowing of the scope for federal enforcement of anti-corruption law, both federally and domestically. Why is that a problem? I think this is actually something that'll be interesting for social scientists to study. What are the effects of this? It'll be challenging, but I do think we should be concerned, right? As Gerhard said, there is a lot to be said for having some sort of centralized federal agency enforcing anti-corruption norms. And the potential effects are on deterrence, but also in terms of the message, right? The message that's being sent by all of this is that the US federal government doesn't care about corruption, or at least not when it's being committed by its friends, right? And that was sort of not quite below the surface, the text of the executive order on the FCPA, and certainly part of the background to the Adams decision. So that is the concern, and that it might increase corrupt behavior, both by reducing deterrence and by sending that message that either everyone's doing it or corrupt behavior is morally legitimate. It also actually might further undermine enforcement by disillusioning and demoralizing prosecutors and investigators, right? If their cases just won't be brought, and if there's that lack of commitment to integrity. So I think there are a bunch of reasons to be concerned. I think it will be challenging for any social scientist to test the effect of these recent developments just because so much else is going on in the world right now. There are a few confounding factors, but it's worth thinking about. Let me just spend the last 2 minutes then talking about, well, what next, what the way forward might look like. Could think about legal reform, right? I have thoughts on what that could look like. Could think about changes in the executive branch. That's not going to happen for a while, so we'll just have to sit tight. But we can also think about relying on other actors, other institutions, thinking in terms of what some people call institutional multiplicity, or maybe a web of accountability, because I think that really is an important part of anti-corruption law in general. We heard a lot yesterday about the possibility of private enforcement, or maybe we should say civil litigation and enforcement. The UN Convention certainly calls for that. And as Mark said, the expertise might be there in the private sector, right? I think there's some important legal obstacles that we can talk about if you like. There are also some practical problems. Non-state actors typically don't come forward. The non-state victims don't come forward. States do. States have tried to sue in US courts. They haven't had a lot of success because of the legal issues that we can discuss. Maybe whistleblower bounties being offered by private actors are a solution. We can talk about that as well. But I think we do also have to think about other public actors. So the US states bringing cases under state law, criminal cases. Foreign states either prosecuting foreign bribery in the way that the UK and Switzerland and France have said that they're planning to do going forward, or countries in the global south, right? Some of the prosecuting their own officials. So just like the US states should do it for themselves, right? You can think that it doesn't necessarily require external intervention. Certainly places like Brazil and China have the enforcement capacity, and going forward, we may have to rely on that. So with that, I'll stop, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And speaking of Global South, let's hear from John, who fought very aggressively against corruption in his own country.
Thank you very much. My background is media and civil society, but I've also worked in government, both in Kenya and in South Sudan. And more recently, 2022 and this year, dabbling in politics a little bit in both Kenya and in Angola. So I would like to bring this experience to this presentation. So the fight against corruption in a country like Kenya, and this applies to most countries in Africa that have a common law system, that were former British colonies and the like, really came to us in its current form in terms of the institutions and the laws that have been implemented across a large part of Africa after the end of the Cold War. So it came together with democratization, the introduction of liberalization of political pluralism. So we had multi-parties, free media, civil society, etc. So it all starts around 1990. Prior to that, many of the countries in so it's called Anglophone Africa in particular, the model that they use in terms of the fight against corruption, where they took their visits for the civil servants and politicians to learn how to deal with corruption within their politics and bureaucracy, was Singapore. And Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew was very open to delegations that came from Africa that wanted to learn this. And he was very forceful in insisting that you should have an independent institution that is tackling corruption, separate from the police. By 1998, the IMF and World Bank had picked up anti-corruption, and it was interesting to hear about the new governance diagnostic that is being implemented by the IMF. But anti-corruption had become a conditionality for countries that were seeking loans by the end of the 1990s. And so if you look across about 22 countries across sub-Saharan Africa, the legal and institutional infrastructure for fighting corruption looks and sounds the same. And it is born, I would argue myself, starting with really the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act here in the US, 1977, the OECD Convention Against Bribery of Foreign Public Officials, and subsequent legal instruments and treaties that have been domesticated in a whole range of countries across the continent. And one can tell, if you ask, do you have an anti-corruption agency, a dedicated anti-corruption organization that investigates and prosecutes corruption, and you find over 24 of them that look very, very similar. And they all date back to around this time. 2001, 9/11 takes place, and the steam starts to leave the energy simply because of the distractions that were here in the West in terms of just the capacity as officials were investigating corruption in these sort of democratizing countries, picked up the phone seeking assistance from the Justice Department here, etc. It became a bit more difficult because we were distracted investigating other things. The invasion of Iraq, the 2008 financial crisis, had a similar impact in terms of the ability of sometimes anti-corruption institutions that had limited capacity seeking assistance from developed countries like the US. This also, this period between 2003, when we had the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, sort of the treaty that brought all of us together and led to the domestication of anti-corruption legislation that sounds very similar across the world. It chimes with another important geopolitical development that has affected the ground on which we are tackling anti-corruption across Africa, and I've seen similar trends in Latin America and parts of Asia, which is China had begun an aggressive push in terms of trade in Africa, and it is now the most important trading partner for the continent, and this, especially given developments here, is a relationship that is going to deepen, but it's hugely consequential in terms of just the normative environment for these issues. Everything started at the end of the Cold War. It was basically a series of Western-type institutions that all these countries were implementing. Judiciary, civil society, free media, etc. Questions are now being asked as to the viability of that model in this day and age. Let me jump into the lessons for me after 30 years in this sector. I think it was in 2015, an organization based in the US here in Washington, DC, Global Financial Integrity, used to publish an index of African countries that had basically measuring the quality of their financial and the institutional and legal infrastructure for the fight against corruption. who had passed an anti-corruption law, who had a financial integrity unit, et cetera, et cetera. The training of officials and the like. And this index by GFI didn't last more than a few years because they found that the countries that kept on coming out on top, including my own Kenya, tended to be at the bottom 25% of the corruption perception index and weren't moving despite the fact that all these laws and are being passed and all these institutions being created. There's an important lesson there. It's basically the importance of politics in the fight against corruption. And this brings me to my 7 or so lessons from this fight. Number one, we haven't cracked, and they say, democracy is the worst system of government except all others. I would agree with that strongly. But the one thing that we haven't cracked, and I've experienced this in multiple countries now in Africa, democracy is very expensive. And the same cast of characters who pay for politicians to hire helicopters and the like is the same. You go from one capital to the other around election time, and you're bumping into the same characters in offices, and it's a problem that we have not resolved. Second, great power competition between countries like the US and China means that corruption is actually, my experience, a tool of geopolitical competition. It's almost as if who can bribe biggest, most cleverly to achieve their strategic objectives. It's a cold game, and sometimes I get a bit uncomfortable about the very strong focus on China here in the US, because in Africa, the locus of attention in terms of where resources are being managed out of in this area is in the Middle East. It's in Dubai. Those are the relationships that are most consequential in terms of changing the environment on which anti-corruption work takes place. Thirdly, the enduring lesson has been the private sector treats corruption as a tax. They will make statements about it, but for them, if the corruption is predictable and consistent, they will not complain about it, because they know that $100,000 next year, $100,000 the next year, and everything continues. When that consistency and predictability goes, everything changes. Thirdly, an important lesson for me is that in all these elaborate institutional and legal infrastructures that we set up for the fight against corruption across Africa, we didn't spend enough time and attention dealing with how do we manage transition when you're moving from an authoritarian system to a more open system. How do you deal with past corruption? We copied the Hong Kong Anti-Corruption Agency, but forgot that that included, when it was started, it included an amnesty provision for the Hong Kong police. I'm running out of time, but I'll just mention 2 last things. Number one huge lesson is that the weakest, but not the weakest, but the least effective tool in the fight against corruption, the least successful, is prosecution, especially in a developing country. Especially when you're prosecuting people who are close to the center of power. There are a whole range of other ethics-related instruments that one can use, efficiency-related instruments that are far more effective. Trying to prosecute a president or prime minister is important, and one has to start, but recognize that that is a slow and painful process even in developed countries. Finally, we never spent enough time on understanding how to manage perceptions of elite behavior when it comes to corruption. And this is now I'm seeing is true also here in the West, where perceptions of conspicuous consumption on the part of leaders has a huge impact on how the public regard their leaders, their democracy, and their politics. and especially on young people and social media, has a disproportionate impact in terms of people perceiving how corrupt their politics is. I was going to say something about the FCPA and our experience in its regard, but I'll stop there and wait for questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, John. And now the impossible task of bringing everything together is left to Vic.
A few weeks back, I was talking to Anath, and I was like, what have you signed me on to? You know, this is such an open canvas. And then I came and said, you know, it's actually a fun panel because I learned a lot thinking about these issues again. So I'm actually a professor at the GSP. I work mostly, I come from a finance angle, so I'll try and link this, you know, a bit with some of the things that I've done when it comes to financial regulation, and there's sort of very common themes out here, especially when you think about, you know, design of institutions, supranational institution or international coordination. You'll see the same sort of things that come out here, that are relevant here as well. Okay, so let me, so I don't need to sort of, you know, there are several definitions of corruption. I'm going to sort of keep a very broad one, which is the abuse of, you know, entrusted power for private gain. And, you know, corruption, you know, we all know is, you know, as ancient as organized society, not a new phenomena. And, you know, it comes in different forms, et cetera, and there's a lot of literature that talks about the economic costs of corruption. And if somehow we could, you know, we could improve on things, you know, this would be fantastic. So I think there's a general agreement on that. Luigi also started by saying that this is not just, you know, people used to initially think that whenever we talk about corruption, we talk about developing economies, you know, corruption in India or corruption in Africa. You know, all the examples of corruption was almost that. But, you know, my own research in Germany, you know, looking at, you know, networks of clubs and bankers meeting, you know, it was quite clear that there was a lot more happening out here. It's just a more subtle form, but, you know, corruption exists, and I you know, I can go on with examples, but I think we've heard plenty, and the list is endless. So what I'll try and do in the next bit is just try and sort of solidify what has already been said, and, you know, and think about some, you know, ways in which we can think about solutions to this, because otherwise it sort of comes out, you know, if you start reading about it, it looks like, my God, this is just unstoppable. And so my approach here would be just to sort of try and draw lessons, and maybe I'll end up with a very sort of a positive note on India. We heard from Vic yesterday on how corrupt Indian courts are, and I'll try and provide a different spin on India, a sort of a more positive side on how actually democracy is quite working, and where the trend is in the right direction, and I'll sort of end with that. I'll also throw in that an important part which has been left in this discussion when we're talking about how to tackle corruption, which is how do we build capacity? How do we educate people? And one of the things about the Indian experience has been that when India got their independence, the amount of investment they made in education, creation of the IITs and the Indian Institute of Management, etc., was one of the fundamental drivers of why, when aid and when people talk about aid not working in other countries, and when India liberalized and finance came into India, why it grew, because there was the capacity that was available to use that capital in a constructive way, and that actually then generated a lot of growth. So I'll talk about how it has kept those institutions free from corruption. Getting into IITs even today is something that cannot be manipulated. The civil services exams. So there's sort of an approach to that stuff which I think is quite useful. And if time permits, I will talk about the recent elections in India, which is also a sign of a healthy democracy, where there was a threat that people are talking about getting enough votes to change the constitution of India, and when people went out and voted, the Modi government did not even get a majority. So there are ways in which how education empowers this fight against corruption. I mean, this is something that has sort of been not talked about, and how we can sort of think about building capacity on that front. So let me start with talking about one of the things that we talked about, and I'll talk about this in a domestic sense, which is about building legal institutions. And at the end of the day, if you think about the economic discussion, the framework that we refer to, it's sort of a principal agent type of a problem, where what you're trying to do essentially is think about rules which will make people behave the right way, right? Bad behavior, you define it, you punish it. I mean, these discussions are all very good, but there are a few things one needs to realize when you're talking about fighting against corruption. One is corruption is very difficult to measure. Okay, and you know, we've had this literature on discrimination in the, you know, going back to Gary Becker's work, where we tried to figure out whether this is taste-based discrimination or is it statistical discrimination. And there's tons of literature, and we sort of find it very hard to sort of understand it. The second thing is, even blatant forms of corruption, which we all agree on are corrupt, right? There are a lot of incompleteness in contracts. So we think about this principal agent where everything is complete, everything is specified, and so something wrong happens, we can go ahead and punish the person. But what happens when things are not said? Who has the decision rights in that, in such a scenario? And it's these elected officials, certain people we put in power, but what we do is we give them a lot of discretion to interpret things when these contracts are incomplete. All right? But the moment we give discretion, we also have to think about who monitors the monitor, who monitors the decision makers. And so thinking about the whole thing and how politics interacts with this, you know, we run into the stuff, we can write all the rules we want, but we don't think about the enforcement problems, and it becomes quite complicated. So one of the things that has not worked, at least I can talk about the bankruptcy law, is that, you know, the World Bank went to a lot of countries and says, you know, we have this study in Law and Finance by Schleifer et al. Shows legal institutions, if you prove it like that, generate growth. And the same thing happens in corruption index, etc. But that's a very Western-centric view of what works here. These things cannot be transplanted without a problem to other institutions. There are a lot of subtleties out there. And without appreciating that and trying to pay this paternalistic approach or whatever, right, that this is the institution we're going to impose on you because we think this is good for you, this can backfire and have a lot of unintended effects as well. And I think this is something that needs to be thought about. I mean, I can talk, I don't know if time will permit, but there are a lot of informal mechanisms, like for example, in India, even though the legal system is quite weak, you know, microfinance was a way in which people could use social sanctions to strengthen rights. And they strengthened it to such a large extent that people were dealing with suicides and stuff like that. So there are lots of other mechanisms that sometimes come in and fill in the gaps. So, you know, I know Paula is going to talk about the role of culture, etc. But I just wanted to say a discussion without understanding the details of the countries that one is involved in is sort of, there's an incomplete view. I want to say something about the transnational, you know, approach to tackling regulation, which is also something that, you know, I've done some work on financial regulation, etc. And I'll sort of draw a parallel between bank regulation, and then I connect it so that you understand this whole idea of a coordination problem that is there, you know. So why is there so much interest in, you know, fixing corruption in different countries, okay? You know, this is not out of some, you know, there are profits to be made out here. Let's be very upfront about it. This is not charitable work that is going on, okay? I understand we want to always talk about how we can help the poor, improve, etc., but nobody cares a damn on what's happening unless their own interests are involved in it. So let me put it like that in a rather blunt way. What has happened is that with the globalization that has taken place, now there's a lot of interdependencies have been created across economies, all right? And so initially when the banks, when we're thinking about regulating banks, the main thing was that, you know, the US banks face a lot of competition from Japanese banks. That was a fact. Okay, Japanese had a different set of rules, lower capital requirements. Think of capital requirements as, you know, a tax or whatever. Okay, and this, what it generated was the Western banks felt threatened because the Japanese banks were expanding. And a coalition was needed to stop that. And that got what gave rise to the Basel regulations. So there was a coalition that came to resist the Japanese competition. All right, that was the starting point of this whole thing. And then what happened was, you know, of course, there is, of course, this other side of it, which is coalitions can be good as well, which was also this discussion that on their own, if you ask the countries to improve their corruption laws or to improve their regulations, they face this trade-off as well. On one hand, they want to have the right institutions in place, you know, to promote financial stability, etc. But if you're competing in the international space, you're disadvantaged compared to your competitors. So there is this tension, and sometimes a coordination like that can also be good. So I don't want to talk only about the negative side of it. There are the coalitions which have also been proven to be useful. But what I wanted to make a point was that this move towards supranational institutions or the move towards these coalitions comes with a lot of suspicion from the others, because a lot of times they're not involved in these discussions on how these rules are going to be made, and then they're imposed on these countries and say, this is how you're going to do about it. It's sort of very similar to the point that I was making about the transplant effect. And a lot of them, these rules then have an effect on restricting growth in these countries. We're seeing this happening in the ESG space as well. This is how it should be done. After polluting the world for a long time, now we're preaching how the others should go about, doing it. Some of it is in the right direction, and some of it needs to be thought through. How should we think about transfers, etc.? So there are these different sides of it, and I think that there is this issue of Western hypocrisy that has been talked about earlier is becoming more and more prevalent. Okay, so if there are genuine attempts that are being made to tackle things, I think the important thing is for there to be some credibility in making sure these coalitions are stable. The incentives are preserved, because especially what's happening right now in the US, where things are going back and forth and people are sort of losing this faith in this stuff in the Western. So I think there's something to be talked about, the Western hypocrisy, and also as Western democracies as being enablers of corruption as well. We talked about, and I'm sure it'll come up in other discussions as well. So I think I have spoken a lot on some of these issues, but I think they're not just, these are not bandages you can put out there and fix this and fix that. An attempt has to be an attempt which has to be driven by fundamental principles, some frameworks that we all need to agree on, and then only can we talk about, making this effective. But, as such, I don't think there's any disagreement in whether corruption is bad or not, but there is a political economy side to this as well. Okay, so I think I've already mentioned the stuff on the role of education, which is something that has been missed about. I talked about the IITs in India and what they did for but it also sort of these studies which talk about foreign aid. We've sent so much foreign aid and corrupt in these things, and they don't really work. I think there is something to be said about a solution which builds this absorptive capacity. How can we actually absorb this in the right way so that we can help with that? I think that's all I have to say now, but I'm happy to. I've said a lot of provocative things, and I'm sure I'm going to be. I'll have to defend some of that, but I thought put it on the table.
Thank you very much. Let me challenge a bit what you're saying, and in essence, to me, corruption is a social phenomenon. And I always like to compare to waiting in line for a service. You go to some countries and people naturally queue in line, and others is a mess. And even if your norm is to wait in line, if you go to one of those countries where it's a mess, you're forced to play the game, because if you don't cut the line, you're going to go behind, because everybody cuts the line, and so you go behind. And if everybody respects the norms, it's very easy to respect the norm. If everybody does not respect the norm, it becomes almost impossible to fix it. And here I agree 100% with John when he said, unfortunately, prosecution is the least effective tool, because you cannot change a social norm with prosecution. Prosecution is designed to punish deviation from the social norm. If you're trying to change the norm with prosecution, you end up in trouble yourself. And I was trying to tell that to people in Brazil with Lava Jato, because having seen this with Mani Pulite, clean hands in Italy in the early 90s, I knew that was the outcome. And they said, no, we are different, we learn, blah, blah. And so my question for all of you is, and this is a bit an anticipation maybe of the panel we have tonight, but given that Gerhard cannot join tonight, maybe he has a chance to answer this, is what can we do to create the social norm? Because I agree 100% with you, Vic, that education is important, but I'm not so sure we give the right education. So I used to teach, I dropped it because now it's too old, but I used to teach and have a business case that had the real name of a company, Peter Wendell, a venture capitalist here around the corner. And in this case, at some point, a company offers a personal warrant to the venture capitalist if the deal is signed. And so I kind of discussed the case in class, and I said, do you think that is funny? And most people are completely unaware. And I said, look, in my country, these are paid in a plastic bag full of cash, but you shouldn't be sort of, the fact that money is more greasy shouldn't make a difference, because if it's called a warrant, it's still money. But we don't teach that stuff. And so starting with you, Gerhard, what can we do, and in our different roles, to actually help change over time the norms of corruption?
Thank you. First of all, I have to say that in my cases, there is very little formal corruption involved. It's more the give and take, conflicts of interest. So perhaps a wide aspect or wide interpretation of corruption. And let me just, one thing where the role of prosecution and how can we maintain social norms go hand in hand. The law firm Freshfields has an important role to play in, or played an important role in the Cum-Ex scandal. And their head of tax issues was promoted head of the global tax department. And the firm knew at that time that he was involved in illegal deals. That didn't bother them, in my interpretation. Now he is in prison. He got convicted. And that sent shockwaves through the law firms, because before that, they thought they would be above the law, always putting a disclaimer, we are not accountable, and now they know they can be held accountable. And this, in that respect, prosecution of those who are visible, in white-collar crime, can create or reinforce social norms. And what I observe here is that what strikes me most is that most remain silent. And I would have hoped in such a huge criminal case, there are at least some experts of the financial industry in Germany who speak up and say, such things shall not happen. And we are against that, and we draw consequences for our firms, we establish better compliance, etc. Everybody remains silent. And therefore, prosecution is key to reinforce certain social norms.
So this is an invitation to our friend sociologists that yesterday gave us such a beautiful example of creativity in doing research, and maybe they could find some research of saying what are the implications of Eric Adams getting away, and what are the change in social norms that something like that happens. So, Kevin, what is your view?
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with you.
Okay.
I think you could make some sort of case that prosecution can build norms. The example of the FCPA, especially past 2003, might support that it's created the prosecutions have created a norm, at least amongst a certain category of large multinationals based in certain countries, against paying bribes. You could make that argument. But I could imagine reasonable people could disagree on that front. I think I'm more convinced, though, that non-prosecution or failed prosecution can destroy norms. So
that's for sure.
Yeah. So I think cases of impunity that go on are problematic. When you see blatant corrupt activity that's not being punished, I do think that has the possibility to destroy norms. So in the Adams case, I think it's actually, we're worse off than if the case had never been brought, because all the behavior has now been documented and it's going unpunished. So on that front, again, I don't have evidence that would meet the standards of a peer-reviewed journal, but as a person who's lived in the world, I'm convinced that non-prosecution will have those kinds of effects. And it's also unfortunately true, I think, that failed prosecutions will have a similar effect. You know the saying, if you shoot at the king, you'd best not miss. And so unfortunately, there's an argument to be made for only trying to bring the easiest cases as a prosecutor in the most high-profile settings.
John.
I come from a part of the world with the world's youngest population. And in Kenya last year, in May and June, we had more or less spontaneous demonstrations, public protests across the country that had no ethnicity, just young Kenyans, very unhappy, primarily about corruption. And I think in there lies the material that you need to change social norms. Because these are young people expressing the kind of future they want for society. So I think it's how leaders take advantage of those moments, never let a good crisis go to waste. I think that's critical. My experience has been where you have democracies, no matter how imperfect, the moment the election is complete, you have a window that lasts no more than 18 months to do some of the big things that you want to do in this area of dealing with corruption, dealing with some of the big cases or significant human rights abuses. If you don't set the trend in that first 18 months, then you're waiting until the cycle is complete. So it's moving when the opportunity is there, recognizing the opportunity and striking where the iron is hot.
I mean, theoretically, I agree with this idea that prosecution can change it. The devil again is in the details of how you sort of measure corruption, and a lot of times it's as blatant as someone passing money to someone, and you can watch it, and you can then penalize it if it's so clear like that. But oftentimes it's very subtle, and I was saying measurement of corruption has to go hand in hand, because what you also don't want to be doing is using this as a tool to go after the wrong people or people who are bringing in good change. So it all needs to be, there has to be a balance on that front.
But going back to you for a second, Kevin, because as Vic said, blatant corruption, Senator Menendez eventually was convicted, okay? And this is because he ran away with gold, and it's very tangible, okay? While the case of McDonald, he was providing access. And I'm not defending McDonald in any form or shape, I want to be very clear, but in many other situations, we allow the sale of access and people get away with that. And it's just, when you step down from prestigious jobs, you pay fortune mostly to provide access. And we don't consider, we is the society in general, we don't consider that corruption. So where do you draw the line?
To be honest, the decision at McDonald doesn't trouble me nearly as much as some of the other cases or scandals that we've discussed, for precisely this reason. And this was the view of the unanimous Supreme Court as well. For them, it wasn't sufficiently far over the line, or it wasn't sufficiently clear that it was over the line to justify a federal criminal conviction. And they had basically two concerns. One, they were worried about just capturing normal political activity, right? Ordinary politics as usual in the United States. And so, yes, so they had your concern. But they're also concerned about federalism. They thought it should not be up to the federal prosecutors to decide about what are appropriate interactions between the people of the Commonwealth of Virginia and their elected official, but rather it should be up to the people of Virginia. And I have some sympathy for that idea. So wherever the line is going to be drawn, perhaps it should be drawn by the people who are most directly affected. In this case, it would be the local population. Personally, I would have said what he did was over the line, but if I think reasonable people can disagree about that. And that principle of subsidiarity has some appeal to me. I just wish that the United States would apply the same principle when it comes to overseas bribery, right? And be as deferential to populations outside the United States when it comes to defining bribery.
Okay, now, one of the problems with bribery is that it takes two consenting parties, and more often than not, we end up penalizing the party that is corrupted and not enough the corruptor. And what can we do to penalize more the corruptor? Because at the end of the day, maybe the way is to shame who pays the bribes, not who receives the bribes. Gerhard.
Well, when I look at the cases I talk about, until now, mostly those who paid are on trial, because that's where the illegal schemes were that later was invested in political or public interventions or academic activity that went in the wrong way. So that wouldn't hold for the cases I talk about, but it's because it's not a typical corruption case. Yes, I think we have to look more on where the money comes from. That's why I mentioned before, in the current economic system, where it's so easy to raise money so quickly with illegal activities and opaque financial structures, I think we have to look also at the basis where the money comes from and make sure we don't allow for the financial system, like the judge said before, when you have cryptocurrencies where it's so easy to pass money on and reinvest illegal money, then it will be extremely difficult to confront those who pay and those who do the illegal economic activities.
Kevin, what do you think?
I may also be the wrong person to ask, because in my day job I focus on a statute that only covers the bribe payers, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So we certainly know it's possible. I think in general the idea is, well, first of all, if you make sure that everyone is potentially liable, you can establish a prisoner's dilemma, so that's one thing. And then secondly, one of the later panels will focus on a lot of the lessons we've learned from the FCPA context about organizational liability and whistleblower rewards, and making sure that everyone who knows anything about the fact that the bribe has been paid is in a position to share information with the authorities to help inculpate them.
So, John, you were a whistleblower, right?
Yes. I think that, maybe it's just showing my age, but I've become, over time, much more uncomfortable with moralizing about bribery too much, because one recognizes that, especially to poor people, corruption or bribery reaches them as extortion. That if you don't pay this $1, $2, you're not going to get the following service. It's a young mother who needs to get a scan in the hospital. She's asked for that. She'll pay because she's pregnant, etc., etc. Similarly, for business actors, and this is where it gets much more complicated. It's unpopular, but sometimes you draw the distinction between to what extent is the quote-unquote corruption in a situation solving a problem, and to what extent is it has the entire scheme been designed exclusively to enrich a few people who then externalize it. And I think for me, I find it's important to make some of those distinctions. Especially private sector actors are able to adapt extremely quickly. I always say, as Kenyans, we say we drive very badly. Our roads can be quite dangerous, but Kenyans in the US drive very well. Human beings are extremely adaptable, and it's not something that is inside us. So I'm cautious about, and I'm willing to stand back and say, this businessman who is quickly seems to be pushing to pay so that he can get some goods out of the port, might be solving a problem that needs to be solved, sometimes just bureaucratically, and standing back and arresting him and holding him in court might be counterproductive in the grand scheme of things. It might not be a popular thing for me to say, but
But so what is productive in that particular case?
You've got to acknowledge that sometimes fixing the inefficiencies that you have, bureaucratic inefficiencies, system problems, is often as important as implementing the quote-unquote anti-corruption legislation and rules that you have. That sometimes the corruption that you see might be a response to the inefficiencies and problems and just structural deficiencies in your situation. I worked for a time in a country where I had to acknowledge that I was being asked to advise on anti-corruption, and we had certain pillars, but some of the people, senior officials who I was working with, didn't know how to use Microsoft Word. So how do I deal with that? And it's a reality. This is not a person who is dishonest or anything. It's just, this was the situation after a long civil war. And I think that if you don't correct for those kind of situations, then the machinery that you implement, will just frustrate. And in this day and age of social media, especially in capital cities, lots of young people, lots of Twitter and the like, the negatives will be amplified, intensified, and accelerated extremely quickly. And the political class finds themselves under siege very rapidly. And then you have very undemocratic decisions being made to deal with that secondary problem.
No, I think I'm, maybe it's more because I sort of come from India, and so I sort of have a very similar response to it. That a lot of times, tackling things in isolation, like bribes, solving the bribe problem, doesn't really fix things. We have the theory of second best in economics, which also tells us that we can actually make things more worse. And there's some institutional changes that are required. There's some archaic regulations and institutions in place, and therefore targeting it can actually make things a lot worse. Also, this idea of punishing the bribe payer. There's so many ways to manipulate it. I'm looking at from the context of lending in India. Right? A lot of times, the loan officer who's given the loan has been doing it because of the pressure from the CEO, and the CEO doesn't even sign that loan document. So there's so many ways in which you can actually, so if you get a rule in place, people will bypass it. And I think the way to think about it is how to, maybe undo the regulations or fixing things on the institutional side and putting all that together, and then everything will fall in place. And that requires a political will. And that's why I was saying, this patchwork is not really working. And when I said about education, it's just about people being informed. What's the role of media if people are not even literate? You can provide all sorts of documents, but they need to be able to understand things. And I think education has played an important role. And I think the same thing happens in the U.S. as well. The disparities between the African American and the whites. A lot of it is that there's a lot of aid money going in, but it's not really having an effect on where it really matters. And I think, but that's my 2 cents.
We all agree that basic education is very helpful. And by the way, start preparing questions because I open the floor in a second. But we all agree that basic education is good. But going back to Gerhard's example, Germany is a clearly very educated country. There wasn't any particular appetite to discuss the Cumac scandal in the media. There wasn't a huge political mandate to fight this. So how do we create this demand? We are all in one way or another in the business of education or the media, and so what can we do? Gerhard, do you want to start? What can we do?
I'd like to strengthen the role of whistleblowers. To my experience, when we have mafia-like structures and it's very opaque, the system that is created, it's almost impossible. And almost everything we learned in the Cumac case came from whistleblowers. At the beginning, they were ignored, but when finally the government and prosecutors got a first idea, that came from whistleblowers. And it's really sad that Germany doesn't pick up the good experience from other countries, namely the United States, where there are financial incentives for whistleblowers. It might be different in other fields, but in the financial sector, and always when it gets really, there's a real small group of experts who have a specialized knowledge, it's very difficult for the government to get in without a whistleblower. In other cases, like we had a Wirecard and a real estate thing, these two were more like Ponzi schemes, and then things were cleared up only after bankruptcy. But that's really late, and you cannot always calculate with bankruptcy, especially when things go well for the criminals.
Any suggestion from any of you on what
I think the way to think about my education point is more on removing opacity. So, but I understand the drawbacks of that as well.
So this is a big trade-off with privacy, because people, whenever you try to investigate and the thing is privacy. So should we get rid of some of the privacy?
I can wave my hands as an economist, but I don't have I wish I had a cure, a tablet which everybody could have in the morning, and we'd get rid of corruption.
Kevin, any suggestion?
Well, I know we've got a lot of people in the audience. One thing I'll say, though, is I think we do have to go back to making the case for why corruption, or the particular form of corruption that you want people to resist, is actually socially harmful, right? As opposed to just a way of cutting red tape. This is an old debate, actually. When I first started studying corruption in the 90s, this was a live debate. Is corruption functional or dysfunctional? I tell my students that you can't make the former argument in polite company these days, but it's interesting that it's come back. And because there's something to it. It actually, it's possible.
Okay, so why don't we open the floor? Who has any question? Naomi.
I just think it's important to put some analytical content on the word corruption, because it's not the same throughout history. It's not the same in all places in the world. Its implications aren't the same in all situations. So my co-author, John Wallace, would define two terms, systematic corruption and venal corruption. Systematic corruption being built into the way power works in the entire society and the economy, and venal corruption being, people bribing or cutting corners, doing things that are not right, paying off people. And so I think some of this discussion here is you're sort of talking past each other because you're using the word corruption to mean very different things. So when John says that prosecution doesn't help, he's really talking about a situation where there's systematic corruption. But when Gerhard says it helps, he's saying something very different. He's saying that this is a world where we have venal corruption, and then prosecution really matters because it sends a signal and it really can do some work. So I think it would be helpful to put some analytical content on this.
Thank you, Naomi. I will collect a few questions. Vic.
Thanks. Very much enjoyed the panel, and I totally agree that if you're going to address corruption, however broadly you define it, you want to use as many tools as you can, bounties and so forth. But to underscore the point that Vikrant was making about education, for some years I've worked with Niti Aayog, which is a nodal policy organ of the government of India, to look at different ways in which you might try to change norms around corruption. And they came up with a really interesting idea, which was they said that they thought that a lot of standard corruption was a result of people accepting it as a cost of doing business or just a cost of transacting. And their idea was that if we can get them to think that it's not necessary to do it, or that it's for some period of time, then when people demand bribes later, they will be unwilling to pay the bribe because they said, we don't need to do this, why are we doing this? So they built upon a pattern the government of India had been doing for some time, which is moving towards government services being more technologically oriented. So you can apply for licenses and services directly through online portals, and then you don't have interactions with government officials. There's no opportunity for them to demand money for taking a bribe, for using their discretion. And what they've been finding is that the sets of people that have been sort of using these online services after about 4 or 5 years become increasingly reluctant to actually pay bribes in other areas, which I thought was really interesting and a way to sort of bootstrap the education point that Vikrant is making, which is a great way to try to build norms, but in a clever way. They're using the technological interface as a way to sort of begin to change norms in interesting and maybe insightful ways.
Fabio.
Thank you. Just to say that I'm always very skeptical and worried when I hear that the point of the education is too much stressed. I'm not saying that the only way is to put people in jail for crime or corruption, but it's really discussing, my opinion, about something very vague when you say people must be educated. But what is obvious? And another thing that is very worrying for me is that sometimes we discuss in various circumstances, various fora of corruption in very general terms, not having a direct and concrete examination of specific points. For example, how the prosecution works in a country, how the judiciary works, how the politics works. So this is very rarely straightforward. They don't work straightforwardly. The African countries, for example, are a fantastic case study because all is mixed. Anti-corruption and activists can become corrupt people. Anti-corruption president can say that the other one are corrupted, and the other on the side, the other one say, no, you are corrupt. So it's so confused and complicated that I think that the basic question, and I finish, is was this ever seriously performed, a serious, in-depth analysis on how these different entities works, if their limits are part of this problem?
Thank you. Any willingness to reply to any of these three questions?
No, I think you're absolutely right that there are these different forms, and I think there is a bit of we're not sort of tackling, the reason why. I think we need a framework, and I think that's sort of I would agree with that, and it's a response. A lot of my response is sort of based on my view is you need an integrated way of thinking about corruption, and if you think of bribes in isolation or this in isolation, you're not going to get what you want, and you may make the system worse off than where you started with. And not that I'm trying to encourage bribes, but there is, as Kevin was also pointing out, right? You can have, bribes can, sometimes help in overcoming inefficient regulation, and they can be efficient in many contexts. Yeah, and I also wanted to say that education was not, the reason I put education out there was not because, I'm also coming from a developing country mindset as to what's worked in some places and what has not. But this is not to say this is the only way of tackling it. Of course, I understand the role of institutions, etc. But, to generate, when I was talking about the incompleteness in contracts and how do you sort of make sure that where these gaps are there, do we have really mechanisms? And if you think about democracy and voting as a mechanism that allows for these voids to be filled so that people behave in the right way, and we can sort of punish things, or we can have institutions to enforce certain things. You need that in total. Fabio, I forgot what your question was, but what was I actually didn't hear it.
The characteristic of the institution of prosecution in different countries, and it's easy to say I'm anti-corruption, but then you see very often people that fight anti-corruption that become the corrupted people. So, but Kevin wanted to say something. We're waiting for John to.
Yeah, no. One of the lessons that we are still learning from, we created a range of anti-corruption agencies that are look very similar to each other across Africa. And one of the questions that I've been asking myself and some of my colleagues is that, listen, should we have done this? Because the creation of anti-corruption agencies was a function of the unwillingness or inability of prosecuting officers, attorney generals, etc. They were not prosecuting. So these agencies were created, they were bespoke, they were specialized, the officers had salaries that were better than regular policemen, etc., etc. And what we have found in many cases, these institutions have become institutional orphans because they're not part of the overall architecture of the state. So they're dangling out there, and they tend to face those who are paying them, the donors and others, in terms of who they answer to, and therefore their effectiveness has been quite low. So the thinking that I have increasingly moved to is that perhaps we should have spent more time fixing problems in the police force and the Attorney General's office. Those were the agencies that were mandated constitutionally to deal with the problem of corruption. And because they were not working, we created these super agencies. So this, sometimes in trying to solve a problem, you can complicate it. Mr. Kana raised the issue of leveraging technology. I come from Kenya, where the primary form of transactions, financial transactions in society, is through a mobile app and called M-Pesa. And this is now becoming widespread throughout East Africa. It's an extremely powerful, very empowering instrument. And I'll give you an example of how powerful it is. I was part of an election observation mission in Uganda a few years ago, and there was a lot of chatter on social media. The president was not happy about it. So the internet was turned off. And so as an election observation mission, we quickly started drafting letters. We wanted to complain. We wanted to see the president. And we were wondering, who do we speak to? The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we were making a list of everyone we needed to speak to get the internet switched back on. And it's interesting because of how ubiquitous this technology is in many countries, that ultimately it was the Ministry of Finance and the central bank who went to the authorities and said, listen, if you don't switch this back on, the economy in entire parts of the country is going to shut down, and therefore it was switched back on. And so yes, there are tremendous opportunities that emerge out of this, and sometimes just identifying them and seeing how you can milk them, as it were.
Kevin.
I can't resist endorsing Naomi's call for definitional specificity. It is a pet peeve of mine. I really don't know what to do with the term corruption. Because I'm a lawyer, I tend to think in terms of specific offenses, whether it's bribery, embezzlement, nepotism, conflict of interest, gratuity. To me, these are all very different things. And so I really struggle when people use the broader definitions. And then it is also important, I think, to distinguish between systemic and other forms. And I actually have a whole piece about different ways of defining systemic corruption, whether it's normalized, whether it's the kind that subverts anti-corruption enforcement institutions, and also is it just pervasive and widespread. And these are all different dimensions along which you can define this phenomenon.
I'm just listening to Gerhard. I'm wondering if we really are not just assuming too much that capitalism is not really designed to promote some of the things that we're condemning here and we're criticizing and looking at it. And looking at one or two other issues that are very critical, especially for the academics to start looking around now very critically, one of which is the perception, and which questions the perception corruption index of Transparency Internationally, with apologies. That perception in the global north is more or less like corruption doesn't really happen in the Western countries. And looking at what is being said about, Germany, if all this could be happening, and you don't even have media reporting it, you don't have the OECD or the rest dealing with that. But it's very easy, even for Germans to know about corruption in Nigeria or in Kenya than the ones that you have even in Germany. And the same thing, the second one that I also have to challenge with, which goes to what Fabio mentioned, it's about also the complicity of the political elites and now even the diplomatic community, where you have revolving doors. And I have very critical example. You have a corrupt deal in Nigeria about OPL 245. You have diplomats in the Italian embassy who were offering bank accounts for diverting illegal funds from this deal. You have MI6 guys moving with Shell from the British High Commission to negotiate corrupt deals with corrupt officials in Nigeria. You have the Dutch ambassador tipping off officials of Shell about prosecution and visit of even law enforcement officers from the Netherlands to Nigeria to obtain documents under which Shell is being investigated. And you have officials of Shell who are domiciled in the foreign affairs of the Netherlands government, officials of the foreign affairs operating in Shell. There was a meeting that my organization and others had with the FCDO just 2 weeks ago, and I was shocked to hear about a special advisor in FCDO on Shell, who actually speaks for Shell within the diplomatic community. And now I'm wondering, what are we talking about here? I think it's a big question to ask. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Your next neighbor. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Aaron Glantz. I'm an investigative reporter, and I'm just interested in the comment that John made about there are these moments of retraction. You mentioned 9/11, the Iraq War, and 2008 financial crisis, and I think we can be pretty much assured that we're in a similar moment now. And I'm just interested to hear people speak to that, and in specific, what are the targets of opportunity in moments like the one we're in now?
Jennifer.
So like Naomi, I like to start with first principles, and I know, Kevin, you were talking about this. And so in my work on public corruption and white-collar crime, I've worked toward a definition, right? So if you start with the Latin behind the word corruption, corruptus, it means to damage, ruin, spoil, deface, rot, or contaminate. But when we use it, I think in the legal space, outside of white-collar crime statutes, I think we mean that when someone is corrupt, that they're using a position of trust to betray the person they're supposed to be serving for their own self-interest, right? And this brings me to Vic, because I think this is where, I think the only way we can lift up these norms is even talking past our own silos, because you, of course, as an economist, like to talk about incomplete contracts. But when I talk about trust, I'm really thinking more in the fiduciary space, right? So if you're thinking about these folks as being fiduciaries, whether it's in the public or private sector, then the norm is transparency, or what we would say disclosure. Then the norm is not to say, well, I don't know what I can do, the contract is complete, but to get consent before you act. Then the norm is you are in a position of service. And this, of course, this is separate and apart from what I believe is the mutually reinforcing relationship between prosecution and norms. But I just wonder, just sort of thoughts on that, because I feel like I really hit up against this idea of incomplete contracts, because that sort of feels like free reign.
I'm so sorry, because there are so many good questions, but no time for an answer. So let me thank the panelists, and the time is up. Let's thank the panelists.